Plato's Cave is produced by Muckraker Media. You can find out more at muckrakermedia.org. Welcome to Plato's Cave. I'm Jordan Myers, and today we're going to take another step towards exiting the cave by speaking with the philosopher Russell Blackford. Russell is a senior lecturer at the University of Newcastle in Australia. He is the author of many books, a public speaker and debater, a literary critic, and a legal scholar. And today I spoke to him about his new book that he edited with Damien Broderick called Philosophy's Future. And we also touch very briefly his newest book, which you can order now, The Tyranny of Opinion. I really enjoyed this episode. I thought talking to Russell was incredibly valuable. We spoke about the future of academic philosophy, the pitfalls with it, the upsides to it, the dangers of popular psychology, or popular philosophy rather, and all of those things that are concerning to someone like me trying to go into the field. And I think it's interesting to just general fans of philosophy as well. So with that introduction, please enjoy my chat with Russell Blackford. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to picking your brain this evening for me, and I guess this afternoon for you, right?
Yeah, it's just gone 2:00. Yep.
Okay.
2 p.m.
Well, if I seem off to any regular listeners, it's because it's midnight my time. We were doing this across the world, so so thank you once again, Russell, for being here.
Yeah, pleasure.
So you are, just for people who don't know, and I'll give you a proper introduction before we start, you're a senior lecturer at the University of Newcastle in Australia, and also an author, public speaker, debater, literary critic, and legal scholar. A very wide-ranging job description you have.
I guess that's all true. I've got all that background. Yeah. I did practice law for a while. I mean, a lot of my career has been in sort of law and government and public policy rather than in academia.
And that's interesting. I want to get into the sort of interdisciplinary approach to philosophy. But before we do that, I should say that we are mainly going to be discussing the edited volume that you and Damien Broderick put together. It's called Philosophy's Future. It's about the problem of philosophical progress. But you've also just come out with a new book, right? The Tyranny of Opinion.
Yeah, the Tyranny of Opinion, which I'll... Yeah, that's the newest book. That came out actually late 2018, but it's got a 2019 date on it.
Mm-hmm.
As often happens when a book comes out late in the year. So yeah.
Sure.
So yeah, that's the newest book. I'm working on another book about radical enhancement, radical human enhancement, which is a bit delayed at the moment, like a lot of other publishing projects, for obvious reasons. But the book is delivered and in production. It's just going to take a bit longer coming out.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Yeah. So there will be work to do. There'll be proofing. There'll probably be some small emendations as we go, but it's basically done.
That's. I really look forward to that book. But to circle back around to the book we're currently discussing, I'm curious what went into the inspiration between you and Damien to actually put together this book of collected essays about philosophy's future.
That's a great question, because I really don't have a super concise, good answer for you. Damien and I have been friends for a very long time, and at the time we put that book proposal together, we had just done a book which we co-edited with Wiley Blackwell, the same publisher, which was about, it was called Intelligence Unbound, the Future of Uploaded and Machine Minds, right? So it was about machine intelligence, basically, and the prospects for machine intelligence, which reflects that we both have a long background in science fiction and in thought about the future. That's all a little bit tangential, except to say that Damien and I have a very long-standing relationship, as friends and collaborators. And we were looking around for what the next project might be, because that project went quite well.
Mm.
We brainstormed all sorts of possible ideas. The fact is, this is the one we came up with, but it is a fascinating question. Once you start looking at philosophy in any way, Damien has perhaps a slightly less professional connection with philosophy than I do, though he does have a philosophical background, among other things. There is this long-standing question that arguably philosophy doesn't seem to get anywhere. It goes around in circles. We still don't know whether God exists, as far as the consensus in philosophy can tell us. So that was the issue that we hit upon as a kind of big meta question about philosophy, which we would like, if not answered definitively, at least to get views on. And having just edited a book together, we felt that we could do this. And so we did. We put the book proposal, and the proposal was met with some enthusiasm that went back and forth. And we ended up with a very good selection of people who are prepared to write about it. So that's the story. That's not, as I say, a super snappy, it was this thing that inspired us. But
Sure, yeah.
But, it was a very interesting project for a couple of people who'd worked on a similar project, not long before.
I was curious if it was some, long-standing and deep-rooted frustration that you had with someone or some institution or something.
Oh no, nothing like that. Nothing like that. But there's a frustration about philosophy itself that we don't seem to progress in the way that the sciences do, or the scientists certainly have for, let's say, the past 400 years, and increasingly so.
Mm-hmm. And on that note, I'm very curious because it's obviously relevant to the topic of the book, but what made you interested in actually doing philosophy as a profession instead of just being interested in it?
Again, it's a very hard question. I have this theory that we often don't know our own motivations all that well. So when people ask me those sorts of questions,
you might not be in the
just
best
because
position
I'm
to know.
stumped, but even kind of as a matter of principle, I think it's hard to answer those sorts of questions. But I've always found, whatever I've been involved in, whatever I've studied, that I've been driven back into taking interest in the philosophy of it. When I was studying law, I became very interested in jurisprudence. When I was studying literature, I became very interested in the sort of philosophical questions that surround literature. What is literature? How is it structured? What's its origins? Is it the same thing everywhere in the world? Whatever, those sorts of questions. But my mind seems to work in such a way that I can study anything at all and I'll be driven back to philosophical questions about it. However much I may be fascinated just by the substantive subject matter, I will start being fascinated by those questions. So that's kind of a big picture approach to how I got interested in philosophy. It wasn't something that I originally studied in like my first year of my first university degree. It was something that I found myself increasingly interested in at that time, and which I kept coming back to, increasingly took up over a long period of years. So my first PhD is actually in English literature, not in philosophy. I did a philosophy PhD much later in life.
I actually wasn't aware of that. That's really interesting. And you did your PhD at Monash, is that right?
I did the PhD in philosophy at Monash.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm just sort of curious because it seems, you're obviously based in Australia now and you did your PhD in Australia. What sort of, I'm curious if from someone inside the academy, do you see philosophy worldwide as one collective community, or do you see it as sort of more, geographical pockets of different communities that sometimes collaborate?
That again is a very good question, because I don't think there's a simple answer to that. I mean, even the famous division between the analytic school, if you like, of philosophy, and the continental school, if there's such a single thing. I mean, that's pretty apparent. And there's been a certain almost hostility, a certain distrust or suspicion between those two so-called schools. That kind of divide. Let alone before you get to, say the Indian tradition or the Chinese tradition, or whatever else it might be that you think, as a civilization, created a tradition of philosophy. Those two civilizations certainly did, as I suppose did the medieval Islamic civilization, although it notoriously picked up on the philosophical traditions of parts of the world that conquered, the Greek tradition, Greek and Roman tradition. So it's very difficult to say that there is just one thing here, and some of the interconnections between those traditions are pretty slight. Some historically have been much stronger. I mean, we as the Latin West, or Latin Christendom, if you want, we got a lot of our knowledge of Greek philosophy through Islamic Spain. So there have been all of those kinds of connections and divisions historically. Right now, even within the Anglosphere, there are disconnections. I mean, if you look at what's published in the most prominent journals, Synthesis, Mind, whatever they are, we could probably come up with a list of 10 journals that are thought of as the leading general analytic philosophy journals. The fact is there are a lot of very important philosophers who were not publishing in those journals. That's not where they had their claim to fame. I mean, I don't know if John Rawls ever published something in one of those journals, but maybe he did at some point. But from the point of view of looking at those journals, you'd say maybe David Lewis was the most important philosopher of the late 20th century, right? But I wouldn't want to say that David Lewis was the most important philosopher in the Anglosphere in the late 20th century. I don't know who that would be, but it might be someone like John Rawls or Martha Nussbaum. So it is a very complicated situation. And as soon as you go over across the English Channel, you start to look at a whole different batch of people. It would be very difficult to say that David Lewis is a more important figure than Jürgen Habermas.
Sure.
Or Derrida, it becomes very difficult.
Yeah, I didn't have, an answer in mind when I asked that. I just realized, in sort of preparing for this episode that, obviously I kind of don't have a lot of say in the matter of what I happen to read. Like I've never really read a primary work of an Indian philosopher, like you mentioned.
Right.
And I just, it always makes me kind of question, well, what am I missing there? We all think that we kind of have this broad range of diet in our, intellectual life. And I wasn't really sure. It's almost impossible to sort of, know what you're missing in that sense.
It is. And look, I haven't really read into what is currently being produced by philosophers in India, right? I have done some formal study along the way of classical Indian philosophy. I can't say I've read an entire lengthy work, but I have looked at Shankara's argument about the existence of the spiritual self, which and other such arguments that were produced by that tradition. They produced arguments similar to Descartes. Before Descartes. That's an interesting thing to discover when you delve back into that tradition. But as for keeping up with Indian philosophy, what it is now, well, I don't really know. Because I have an interest in law, and I'm interested in sort of high constitutional law questions that come up, I will occasionally look at the high constitutional, very theoretical cases that arise in other jurisdictions. And it's interesting there, I had occasion to read a case from the Supreme Court of India a year or two back, which was actually about issues to do with recognition of transgender people in certain contexts, right? But they were quoting people like Rawls.
Oh, okay. So it circles back.
So you can find those connections, but it would be fascinating tracing them through more closely.
That's funny. So I have in front of me some notes that I kind of wrote down while going through the book, and I want to get into them. But I think it's really important to first say that I think that when people like yourself and like the contributors to this book write these critiques of philosophy, I think it's always coming from and of course like my interest in it is coming from a place of absolute love and adoration of philosophy, right? Like we
Right.
criticize it because we want it
Mm,
to improve,
mm,
not because we want to tear it down in any way.
sure,
Yeah.
sure. We
So
criticize lots of things because we love them. Yeah.
of course, yeah. And I think, that gets maybe a little bit lost in the current day. I don't think we're very good at always criticizing the things we love. Um, so the book has a pretty wide span of opinion between, defenses of philosophy and
Mm,
critiques of it.
mm.
Um, so currently, I'm curious, where do you fall on that spectrum of being a staunch defender or a critic? And did actually, editing this book push you in either direction?
I don't think it pushed me in either direction. It maybe left me more confused than ever in some ways. I mean, in my introductory piece, I talk about all of the various chapters or articles in there, and I make comments on them, though I want them to stand for themselves rather than just determining who's right. But there were themes that came out in a lot of them that you can identify and agree with, like the importance of not having interdisciplinary silos in philosophy. Maybe we do need to look
Mm,
more carefully at what each other are doing, and there's also interdisciplinary silos. Maybe we need to be a little bit more prepared to, relate to people from other disciplines entirely who have something to say that's of interest. And although this didn't really come up much in the book, even other philosophical traditions, right? I
hmm
mean, this book
hmm
is pretty much written from the point of view of Anglophone analytic philosophers, pretty much. I can think of at least one exception, but
mm,
but it is pretty much from that tradition. But that comes up as a bit of a theme through the book. But as for whether we want to defend philosophy or whether we want to be highly critical of it, well, look, there are reasons why we might be very critical. It's possible that a lot of what gets written is dealing with topics that have been exhausted
mm,
or which are very tangential to what ordinary people really care about, which might be what's the nature of the good life, or
mm,
what on a large scale is a kind of cosmos that we live in, rather than say very um, technical issues like yet another take on the Gettier problem,
I had that as
which
an
is
example, yeah.
yeah. Right.
Yep.
So look, arguably you can criticize a lot of philosophy for being not responsive to what made people care about philosophical issues in the first place, for becoming inaccessible, becoming in-groupish, over technical, those sorts of issues. I think there's some force in those sorts of criticisms. And when Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay, in their contribution to the book, make those sorts of criticisms among others, I think they do have a point that they've probably produced some negative reaction out there from people who've read it. Though I haven't seen much reaction to that particular essay. I think the only reaction I have seen was pretty positive. But still, that would raise hackles. So
hmm
there's some force in that. Um, I think there's also a question that I believe that some of the philosophical questions, some of the very big philosophical questions, do have answers that I find convincing and arguments that I think are fairly much conclusive. Um, on, say, a question like, is morality objectively binding on us, or is there a morality that's objectively binding on us? I think the answer to that is clearly no. But
mm,
that's a very counterintuitive answer. It's an answer that you know people are very resistant to. Michael Smith somewhere says that moral error theory should be a last resort. Well, I'm not sure it should be a last resort if you could stand back from the issues.
Mm.
But you can see why people are socialised in a way that makes anything like moral error theory or moral scepticism pretty counterintuitive and pretty worrying. And I must say, I would not like philosophy as a discipline to achieve some sort of consensus tomorrow that's true and that all the arguments against it are just wrong. I have even almost a temperamental resistance to that. So there's this question. We might be able to reach answers and arguments for them that are actually correct.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly wouldn't reach answers on some of these questions that satisfy me, but is it still premature or risky or in some way just contrary to the spirit of the discipline? Yeah, to say, okay, we've now achieved consensus on those things, say tomorrow. Maybe we should let the argument go on longer with some of those sorts of questions, no matter how satisfied I am. Now, that's all a bit rambling and a bit confused because I feel a bit rambling and confused about that. But it's something that came up very strongly in my mind when I was writing my introduction to the book, that, okay, what would it mean to achieve consensus on an issue like that? What does it mean, not just from a disciplinary point of view, but what does it mean socially if you've got an academic discipline now claiming with all the authority that an academic discipline has that some answer on a question like that is now known, and we now know that God exists, or we now know that God doesn't exist, or we now know that morality is not something that's actually binding on us. It's a kind of illusion up to a point. That might be a useful one. We now know that libertarian free will doesn't exist, say, or we now know that it does. What would it mean socially for an academic discipline to claim to have reached a kind of disciplinary consensus on that? That's a question that doesn't arise in the same way, or very seldom arises in the same way in the sciences. Maybe it did to some extent with evolutionary theory, or back in Galileo's time with heliocentrism. But by and large, those sorts of questions where something very existentially important to people is at stake, by and large, it doesn't arise with other disciplines.
Now, I'm curious, do you think that consensus may not be a good thing because we could be, wrong about the answer, or because something about consensus intrinsically is bad, even if we were correct on the answer?
Yeah, I think it's a mixture of both. So the second one might be a kind of temporary thing. I think it is genuinely premature to say that we've reached the answer on a lot of those questions. There's still good arguments going on. There are still smart people coming up with very interesting considerations the other way, and so on. So it's no matter how strong I think some of the arguments are, it is difficult to say, okay, we really have achieved consensus here. And particularly when some of the answers are iconoclastic, right? The answers I go to those two particular big questions: does libertarian free will exist? Well, I say no. Does God exist? I say no. Does an objectively binding morality exist? I say no. Well, those are all iconoclastic answers for a lot of people. Well, given that there are smart people putting different answers to the questions and with, rigorous arguments or attempts at rigorous argument, I think it would be premature to declare the case closed. It's not just, though, that it's premature. It is a socially interesting question as to whether we can declare things closed on those issues. And I'm not sure what to say here. But with issues that large and which have answers that are potentially so iconoclastic and which are so threatening of people's identities even, you do just have to tread very warily in this area. Now, that's not going to mean I'm going to stop writing the things I write, but I think you have to tread very warily before you say, well, we've got a legitimate disciplinary consensus here, and this is just the answer from now on. We will study morality from now on the basis that it's a kind of social technology. It's not something that transcends human desires and institutions, but it contributes pragmatically to us achieving certain ends that we have because we're the creatures. The kind of answer I'd give, I think you could kind of turn the study of morality into a science that accepts that as a paradigm. But and I argue that in another book that I wrote called The Mystery of Moral Authority. But I would still feel a little uncomfortable if philosophy as a discipline purported to do that.
Okay. I think I generally agree with you there. Because it's funny. I think a lot of intuitions might be pulled by the specific examples given. Like, I personally would be very, very happy if we never discussed, whether there's any good reason to believe God exists ever again. That question's closed for me, or whether libertarian free will exists. That question's closed for me. But you're right. It would be sort of strange if the discipline never spoke about that again. But I guess it's sort of paradoxical because I do think those questions are in some sense legitimately closed. So maybe my thinking isn't consistent there. I don't know.
And maybe mine isn't either. There's a kind of discomfort there.
Yeah.
Apart from the issue that some answers might be premature, there's a kind of discomfort there that's hard to articulate, and it's a little hard even to justify. I'm not even sure that I'm right in having that discomfort, but I do have the discomfort.
Sure. Yeah, we may not have good reason actually to have the discomfort because I guess, just thinking, I guess you could have encountered biologists that had the same discomfort about evolution, for instance, but that's not a good reason why we shouldn't have just, accepted the theory and moved on.
Yeah. And indeed, again, heliocentrism, there must have been a lot of people back in, the early 17th century who were pretty worried about that is the answer because it tended to undermine the authority of the Bible and hence the church, etc. But the empirical arguments in favour of heliocentrism seem pretty compelling.
Sure.
As it happened, they didn't become really compelling until a long time after Galileo thought they did. He was actually wrong about some things, as you know. But they were starting to look pretty compelling, and yet that was a bit of a worry. So yes, is it the same thing? Now, with heliocentrism or with evolution, I suppose part of the answer might be those do seem more empirically tractable. Whereas if I say that, morality is what I just described as being a kind of technology, and we have a kind of illusion that it's something more than that. We rationalise it in other ways, and we're socialised to believe it's binding on us in a way that really it isn't. Although I make those claims, I make arguments for that. They're not necessarily, they're not really the same kinds of empirical arguments that Galileo was making or that Darwin was making. So perhaps there's a difference there, but it's hard. It's hard to know just how much light there is between the kinds of arguments I'm making and those scientific arguments.
Yeah, it's definitely not defeasible in the same way that those two would be. I don't know, for instance, what we could say would disconfirm the theory.
Right.
Besides, maybe something like logical consistency, maybe something like that. But then, you'll get philosophers that discount the relevance of logical consistency on some things too, and it's sort of I don't think we'll ever be lacking in argumentation in that sense, but yeah, I take your point. I don't know actually how analogous is, and I think it was in chapter 9, Stuart Brock actually questions what criteria could even be fitting. For progress of that kind, right?
Right. Look, what would disconfirm some of these arguments, I suppose, would be a compelling argument for a different point of view.
Mm.
But how you come up with truly compelling arguments on something like, say,
Mm.
the objectively binding nature of morality is another thing. I mean, I don't believe anyone has managed ever to do it. And often what is said, well, is we've just got to start somewhere, and we start with some set of assumptions like that. But you look at Kant or whoever may be characterised as having attempted to make arguments,
Mm.
for the as I said, the objectively binding nature of morality. And the arguments inevitably come apart. We don't have what I would at least consider a successful argument for that positive claim.
Mm-hmm.
For the claim opposite to one I'm making. But if someone came up with that, it would disconfirm. But that's not the same as coming up with some kind of empirical observation
Mm.
that would be disconfirming. It's not like finding, fossil rabbits in, I don't know, the Cretaceous or
Sure.
the Cambrian or whatever.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, it's definitely, it doesn't pin you down quite as hard as discovering a rabbit in an era that it shouldn't have been would.
Mm, mm, mm.
There's always room to sort of, whether it's whether it's a cognitive bias or not, wiggle out of some argument put forth.
Well, that's right. There's always some premise that can be denied.
Sure.
In arguments over these sorts of issues.
Hmm.
Now, whether that's somehow defining of philosophy, I don't know, and that's another issue. But certainly with a lot of the questions that we think of now as philosophical,
Mm.
it's difficult to put an argument without premises that someone, without too much trouble, can deny. I think David Chalmers makes a point like that in his
Yeah.
article on the subject. You can find some way without too much discomfort.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's this weird phenomenon, and it's probably more American than any other country. But if you just, simply by asking a question, you will guarantee that you will have some sort of a disagreement. By the very nature of just asking the question, you could win money for the rest of, the universe's time betting on that. And I don't
Yes.
know, to what extent that is. It's obviously a positive thing in some sense, but I think it's also obviously negative in some other senses.
Yeah. Look, America seems to be very polarized politically more than it ever was, and more than perhaps most other countries, even in the Anglosphere. But even if you are teaching a class of, say, first year or second year undergraduate students in a
Sure.
philosophy course, and you ask them to put their hands up on, say, the answer, to one of the trolley problem sort of cases,
Sure.
you're going to get a division.
It's
So
true.
maybe 80% will pull the lever to shift the out of control trolley so it runs over one person, not five, but 20% will say the opposite.
Those
So,
damn
so I don't know. It's very
geontologists.
hard with these sort of questions to get real
It's
consensus on
it's
anything.
true. It's true. It's true. What role do you think, and this is something that, I've really been thinking about as I prepare, to apply to grad schools, about the hyper specialization that you're sort of pushed towards. I think, as you move from, an undergraduate education to a graduate education and eventually to teaching, I think and obviously, you would be able to speak to this far more, but it seems like we're being funneled towards, you mentioned counterexamples on counterexamples of Gettier cases, towards,
Yeah.
very narrow, narrow, narrow questions that aren't the reasons why, someone like me fell in love with the discipline in the first place.
Mm, mm. Or why it's important from the point of view of an educated public.
Sure. Yeah.
Mm. No, I think that is worrying because I think we really are, in a sense, or up to a point here, in order to address those anxieties or that curiosity
Hmm.
that the educated public has, if we are funneled into more and more technical
Mm.
and seemingly intractable problems that we're discussing in a very elite group of journals and so on. I think that is a
Hmm.
worry about whether philosophy is doing what it was there for in the first place.
Yeah.
Part of the pressure is every academic discipline is pressured to follow the model of the sciences, where that kind of hyper-specialisation probably is appropriate.
Mm.
As the scientists discover more and more detail about the natural world, it's quite natural for them to devolve, disciplines and sub-disciplines and sub-sub-disciplines and research programs and sub-research programs. It's a huge professionalized effort, almost like a military effort, if you like, in order to gain that kind of knowledge relating to questions about the natural world that are tractable, but there's just a lot of them. There's just a lot to know. The more we know, the more we know there's more. That seems like quite a good model for the sciences, and the payoff for the public that eventually comes back, apart from popular science books, which are interesting, but the big payoff is technology. The relationship between science and technology is now so important. But if we, as philosophers, are trying to give payoff back to the public, it's going to have to take a very different form. The whole task, insofar as it relates to what we're doing in a society or a civilization or the world, is really now quite different from what the sciences have been doing for the last, whatever it is, 400 years. So.
Yeah, because when I think of examples of philosophers who really are, they have a strong foothold in what's happening in the real world. People like Peter Singer, for instance, or Will MacAskill, or Nick Bostrom. Clearly, I think it's sort of like a tension that I don't know exactly what the right balance is, because clearly, Singer, for instance, is a far more of an expert on ethics than he would be on, maybe feminist philosophy or some other area of philosophy, right?
Right.
But at the same time, he's obviously not, too far down the rabbit hole of the literature to the point where he's not able to have the influence on the world that he has. And I just don't know, personally speaking, because it seems like, obviously you do want to have areas of philosophy that you're more naturally interested in and more learned in. But, I guess I'm fearing going too far down that to the point where your entire career is consumed with counterexamples of counterexamples.
Right. Fortunately, it's not something that particularly impinges on my life now.
Yeah.
Because I'm in a situation where I'm not applying to graduate school. I'm much more at the other end of my the very strange career I've had. And I now have the luxury that while I'm not rich, I have enough money to kind of get by. And, I don't really have to try to get more and more senior jobs or anything like that. And I can then be looking around for publishers who are prepared to publish stuff that is more accessible to a broader general public. Now, I think it's a good thing that we do that. I'm glad that I'm doing it. But, a lot of people are not in a position where they can do that because they are pushed into this model that I think is more appropriate for the sciences.
Yeah. I'm just worried about sort of if going through that model almost sort of destroys or removes people's ability when they get to the end of the tenure track, and they get tenure, and then they can turn around and say, wow, now I can pursue, whatever I want, works for the public or my own sort of, philosophical projects. I just wonder if after years and years of doing the narrow publishing, does that sort of rob your ability almost to make those really, publicly accessible works? I don't know.
Yes, I don't know. I mean, it would be interesting to talk to a whole bunch of people who are much younger than I am, but who are perhaps deep enough into their careers. They might be in their early 30s, people that sort of age, and get their views about that sort of topic. It's always interesting when something a bit like this comes up on Brian Leiter's blog, and sometimes he'll throw his blog open to discussion. I guess you and your audience are aware of Brian Leiter's Leiter Reports blog. And you'll get a lot of people who make points a bit like this, but you will also get people who take the view that philosophy before Frege, say, was all junk, and we should just throw it all out. And what's important is the kind of narrow, specialised, ultra professionalised, kind of rigorous study of language, etc., that sort of characterises philosophy as a discipline in that kind of post-Frege, post-early Bertrand Russell mould. So I don't know. The experience of people saying that must be quite different. But it doesn't sort of speak to me. I do want to be addressing problems that are of some public concern, I suppose. That's kind of my background. It's kind of my temperament.
Mm-hmm. The in thinking about that kind of question, though, the one concern I really do understand, and I share some affinity for, is it's almost sort of like a physics envy of a type, where I think the impulse to sort of retreat or seclude some advanced philosophical discussions in the jargon and in the technical language is an understandable mechanism against, the immediate access of people who don't really know much of anything about philosophy, right? If we kept everything in very, very basic terms, because, I feel like it's easier, and we were talking about this earlier, to disagree with, any philosophical paper that you like, as long as the language is accessible enough. But that's not really possible in something like, organic chemistry. People need to learn the language and the terminology in order to disagree. And people, by and large, are probably too lazy to do that. But it's really easy to say, no, I know that I have free will. I could choose to do anything else right now, something like that. So I share that concern. I understand it.
Well, I mean, the sciences have put up barriers for reasons that are quite justifiable. It's not that they set out to put up barriers. It's that there is just a lot of stuff that is not knowable, without the kinds of methods that are used by science, the kind of instruments that they've devised, the kind of experiments they've been able to devise, the phenomena that they've postulated, and which are not observable without those instruments, are not observable at all. The whole of new stuff actually seems to exist. Entities and forces and so on actually seem to exist, and they need names, and on it goes. They're creating a language which describes a real world that was not accessible, without the methods used by science. Now, I don't know that philosophy is really doing the same thing. It's not closely analogous to that when it throws up a whole lot of this language.
Yeah.
Now sometimes it might be. I mean, in logic, there are concepts, that are developed as logic becomes richer, and we learn more, and logic, of course, does make progress. I think it's pretty clear that logic does make progress. I think that semantics and pragmatics, that kind of study of language makes progress. We know a lot more from philosophers, not just from sort of linguistic scholars. We know a lot more now than we did not many decades ago about language. So some of the terms that we use in those areas of philosophy that pretty clearly do make progress are needed and do relate to phenomena that are fairly clearly there. A lot of the time, though, as I'm reading philosophy from outside those areas that I expect would be more accessible, I even will struggle to get my head around some of the terminology if I'm not really up to date with whatever's being discussed in that area, or by the urge to put arguments into predicate calculus.
Sure.
And sometimes that seems completely unnecessary. I studied this stuff too and taught it, but I then decode it because it's not all that transparent to me as people who are really fluent in it. And I think, well, why is it necessary even to formalise that argument? The argument makes perfectly good sense without being formalised. So what's that doing? It is putting up a barrier to people who don't have that kind of background. But I think it's also a little bit, I don't know, I don't like to be harsh to my colleagues, but it seems a bit like posturing, I can formalise this argument, whether it needs to be formalised or not. But
Yeah.
what's the point of that?
Yeah, yeah, it's funny that you pointed out. I mean, it is almost sort of like a task that justifies itself in that sense. Well, why, if we're gonna uncode it anyway to actually go over it, why did we need to code it in the first place? It does seem
Mm,
a bit, kind of wavy of, hey, look at me, I can do this a little bit.
yeah, a little bit like that. Or at least saying, well, if you have any doubts, you're quibbling with, well, where did this sentence?
Sure.
Well, here I'm going to put it beyond doubt by formal.
Sure.
I don't know. Maybe it's a mixture of all of those things, but it does seem, in many cases, that's not necessary to write in that way. That the argument would have been just as convincing, and the what's being argued would be just as plausible without adopting that sort of style.
Yeah. And I guess to be honest, my understanding and to whatever degree I have it, affinity for that concern, I think really stems from a phenomenon that has been more common maybe for people of my generation than of past philosophers, where I think we're sort of seeing, the rise of these, sort of like pop philosophers in a way.
Right.
People like, Jordan Peterson is recent. Ben Shapiro is analogous to that, maybe.
Mm, mm.
Um,
Sam Harris, I guess. I mean, I
yeah,
think Sam is maybe a bit better than some of these other people, but still, he's doing the
sure.
same sort of thing,
Hmm.
and he will be scathing in an unnecessary and unfair way of actual professional philosophers at times.
I agree with that. Yeah, and it's just, I genuinely think that, maybe I'm being a little hypocritical here, but it's just that, when I see someone, for instance, like Jordan Peterson talk about deeply philosophical questions, it's kind of clear to me that he hasn't read a lot of what I would deem as necessary literature to be
Mm,
talking about those
mm,
things,
mm,
right? And I'm sure that obviously, my own cognitive biases come into play because if he was saying things that I agreed with, I probably wouldn't think that. But, that point aside, I genuinely am concerned about the harm of sort of, in the Socratic sense, thinking you know more than you know about a
mm,
subject. And I think
mm,
philosophy is very prone to that miscalculation of your own expertise.
mm. Well, Peterson doubtless knows a lot about Jungian psychotherapy. He doubtless knows a lot about mythography.
Mm.
There may be some other things that he knows quite a lot about. But yes, if you're starting from the foundation in those disciplines and maybe some other knowledge of the world that he's picked up,
Mm.
and then thinking that you can kind of barge into other areas just based on that and set everyone straight, you can shape up, he tells all these young people,
Yeah,
but he also
yeah,
kind of tells people from other disciplines to shape up because he knows the answer from that kind of disciplinary basis. That I think has a certain, almost a certain arrogance about it. Again, I don't want to be unfair to Jordan Peterson because I think he cops a lot of flack that is over the top and unnecessary and unfair
sure.
to him. But there is that element that we find in him of a kind of not knowing his own limitations, not kind of knowing what he doesn't know.
Yeah,
And we should all, I mean, we all, I'll speak for myself, I'm sure I do this at times too, right? I'm
of
sure
course, yeah.
most people do, but at least I'm aware of it. At least I know that it's a trap that I can fall into. And I try hard not to fall into it. I try hard to be at least fair to people who do maybe know more than I do about some area where I have an interest, and then maybe
Yeah.
to check some other sources. There's a sense that some of these people are not really doing their homework in that way, and perhaps there is just a bit of arrogance about it. They feel they don't need to.
Yeah, and I guess I'm sort of worried about that in particular because I see it as far more of a danger for, my generation that was sort of, you know, we grew up as the internet grew up, and
Mm,
that
mm.
sort of popularization of philosophy, I don't think was possible in the same way before the internet, obviously, where you can
Certainly not in the
watch.
same way. Yeah.
No, no, and I just think that there's a a really dangerous trap of watching, 2 or 3 hours of Jordan Peterson lectures and
Mm,
thinking that you can duke it out on the same level as, an Oxford philosopher on something.
mm,
And it's
mm.
just, but again, to play devil's advocate to that point, you don't want to also fall into an appeal to authority. But I am very suspicious of, how readily and how rapidly people of sort of my generation are comfortable with forming opinions on really, really complicated stuff.
Mm.
And I just
Well,
don't
that's
know.
right.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
And, well, I was just going to say, and people of my generation have probably encouraged this, yeah, in all sorts of ways.
Yeah.
We've, uh, I mean, apart from the fact that we created things like the internet,
Sure.
we've had certain attitudes to education and so on that have probably encouraged this. It is a problem if people are running off to look at YouTube videos rather than actually reading a book. There's such a resistance, it seems, to
Yeah.
actually reading books these days. Yeah, that is a concern. Now that said, perhaps the people who are now watching the Jordan Peterson videos wouldn't have been, engaging with anything at all,
Hmm.
even at that level. So again, we don't want to be unfair to it or say there's no merit to it. And perhaps there's a fair bit to say in Peterson's favour. Some of the fact he's copped, as I say, is unfair, and he seems to have handled it quite well at times.
Hmm.
But it is a worry that someone like him can become a kind of sage, I guess, kind of
Yeah.
sage figure to follow, rather than someone who really is doing the homework and has the kind of epistemic modesty, I suppose, to know they have
Yeah.
to do more homework. So there's always going to be pros and cons, but we have to try to be aware of the cons.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that phrase epistemic modesty really hits the nail on the head for me. Because I think, honestly, having just some or philosophy professors, who, just honestly, were huge reasons that inspired me to actually go into
Mm,
this discipline. The thing that I was so floored by is how great a wealth of information they can have and still genuinely want to know what I think about that. You know what I mean? It's
right.
just it's so beautiful, and I want to emulate that. It's so
Yeah.
inspiring to me.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's really a common feature in pop philosophy.
No, but it is something that does come through. I mean, we've had a lot of criticisms of the discipline in this
Sure.
discussion, but
Yeah.
it's something that, at its best, the discipline does show maybe more than the other disciplines that I've encountered.
Yeah.
Uh, the other place where you do get it a bit is in the law, because there's such an emphasis on being able to argue both sides of
Mm,
almost anything.
mm.
But it is something that philosophy, as its best, can provide, and I'd hate to see it lose that. I feel there are some pressures out there for it to lose that,
Mm.
but it's one of the things about philosophy that can make you love it.
Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely.
Mm,
Definitely. I also wonder, how much of this is a really simplistic result from, trying to justify funding, honestly. Where if we can go to the dean of a university and show them, a logic algorithm,
right.
for decoding things, to an untrained eye, oh wow,
Mm,
that does seem worth funding. Whereas, if we were just showing him, I mean, look at this amazing work by Nietzsche or something, it might not have the same, punch to
mm.
to securing funding.
And in the public higher education systems, there's such a pressure that comes from the government to
Yeah.
be delivering, well, technology,
Yeah.
very largely technology, and delivering jobs in technology.
Yeah.
So that creates a huge pressure on all of the humanities, really,
Yeah.
to be able to justify itself. But it goes back more deeply than that. There is this physics envy thing,
Hmm.
which maybe affects even some of the sciences where it shouldn't. I don't know, but certainly affects other areas of the humanities that we have to kind of emulate their model. We have to have this kind of hyper specialization. We have to be publishing in journals of certain kinds. Those journals should publish work that uses a certain kind of language that's not accessible to people, from outside. For whatever reason, we use this language, whether it's as a barrier or as a way of, preening to each other, the worst, or what it is. We're in all of those disciplines, there's that kind of pressure to emulate kind of the superficial trappings of the sciences.
Yeah.
When what the disciplines are really about, may not, have a kind of policies and a kind of, demands and justifications behind it that the scientists have. They might have different ones, but they don't have those ones.
Sure. Yeah, and it seems like there is also this sort of, I recently read In Praise of Idleness by Bertrand Russell, and it seems like we have, because he talks about how we're sort of, in this current day, and it's funny, he's writing that in 1935 or something like that.
Right.
He's writing about, how in this current day we have this obsession with incrementalism and progress, and it seems like that is a danger to philosophy as well, where it's always, posed in the questions of incrementalism. Well, what can this do for this other discipline, or what can this do, for this other area of inquiry? And I don't think we stop to say, well, wait, what about the questions that actually make the other technology, worth having? Like, what does it mean to have a good life, for instance? And I just, the writing of people like, Susan Wolf, for instance, is just, I love reading that kind of stuff. And
Yeah, me too. I love
it's
work. Yeah.
it's amazing. And honestly, reading these works and talking to people like yourself, that is the end in and of itself for me. And it's not an incremental, what can I bring to this other, area? And it seems like sometimes we kind of miss the forest for the trees in that sense.
Well, that's the criticism, in the book. That's the criticism that Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay are
Yeah.
making, or at least
Yeah.
one of their strands of criticism of the state of the discipline. That, it really should be about things that people care about, like the nature of, what it is to lead a good life. What kinds of, virtues and so on do you need? What's that life kind of like? What does it mean at the political level? Those are issues that people out there actually care about, that people are anxious about, people are intrigued about, and that philosophers have something to say that has a whole tradition behind it and can have a kind of rigor behind it, not necessarily the sort of extreme display of rigor that we were talking about a little while ago, but a kind of rigor about it, and we have something to contribute there. So Peter would like to pull us back to that. Now again, Peter Boghossian is someone who cops a fair bit of flack from other people within the discipline, from elsewhere, but I think he's making a pretty strong point when he says that. I mean, there may still be a great deal about contemporary philosophy that's attractive and useful and and lovable, as we were saying. But there is at least some tendency, I was going to say, for people to forget, but people even almost be pushed away from larger discussion of those sorts of issues and communication with the public about those sorts of issues that are of public concern. And I mean, I do try. I mean, I aim for rigor too. I aim to do my homework. I aim to do all those things that I've been talking about that we should do. But I do want to talk to the public. So I want my work to be as accessible as possible, and I want it to, as much as possible, touch on things that the public are actually worried about. Now, it probably my work gets a little bit technical at times because I have that training too, and sometimes the issues are genuinely hard, and sometimes you do have to grapple with what's already out there, which can be hard. I mean, if you've got to grapple with Kant, even though Kant is very difficult, but you've got to try to do it. Or there's this whole body of stuff you should be taking into account that you're not taking into account. So inevitably, yes, some of my work is going to be harder, just for a person with a general pretty good education but not a philosophy background, it's going to be harder to pick up and read than Jordan Peterson's latest book might be, right?
Sure.
But I still want to communicate with the public and try to be as accessible as the subject matter, permits.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, where that leads us is that's what I'd like to encourage, in other philosophers as well, if I can.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with that. And I see we're actually coming up on the 1 hour mark. So I want to be respectful of your time. But I have a few just final kind of rapid fire questions, just that are really of interest to me, from a philosopher to someone who's hopefully trying to become one. So what I was just curious, are there any recent examples of how philosophy has affected the way that you actually act or live your life?
Oh, that's a hard one. That's a very hard
It is.
question. How I actually live my life. Um, I don't know, because often I'm like every other academic philosopher. I'm often spending my time criticizing other philosophers
Of course.
rather than really taking them on as role models
Mm,
for how I live my life. What inspires me more is people who inspire me to address certain topics or to write in certain ways or think about
mm,
certain things. I've been affected like many people, over the last several decades by things like environmentalism, by very close consciousness of things like climate change.
mm,
But I can't honestly say that it was philosophers who
mm,
put me on to worrying about those sorts of issues, which do affect how I live my
mhm.
life. So that's maybe saying that, that philosophers aren't doing the job for me as much as you might like them to. I hope I'm
Sure.
doing the job for someone.
Yeah. So, how, what and why do you enjoy the things that you do as a professional philosopher, and what do you enjoy the most about it, and what do you dislike the most about it?
Mm. Look, what I enjoy is just learning stuff. I enjoy tackling problems, trying to sort out things that puzzle me or that I find, cause a certain amount of anxiety. I'd really like to understand, what liberalism is, historically and in the world we live in today, and why it seems to be under threat, and what aspects are under threat, and what its future might be, and whether it should be replaced by something else. I actually want to answer questions like that. And as
Yeah.
I study them deeply, I read the material, I dig into the history behind ideas, which is something that fascinates me, the history behind ideas. And I expand and deepen my knowledge. Yeah, that's something I really enjoy. And if having absorbed a lot of that and synthesized it, I can then produce a package where I can give some of that to other people. I mean, that's something I find very satisfying.
Mm,
And what I find really satisfying is those rare occasions, rarer than I'd like them to be, but those occasions when someone comes back to me and says, look, I read your book, or I read something else you wrote, and that was great. It's made a difference in how I think about this topic, and perhaps even how I go about my life. If I've had that sort of impact that I just said not too many philosophers have had on me. But when that does happen, that is
yeah.
a really great feeling, and it does happen some of the time. Now, if I were a very technical philosopher writing these very technical articles
Mm.
on technical areas like, say, the Gettier process, I would not get that kind of kick out of things, because I'd not get people from the public talking to me in that way. I'd doubtless get other satisfactions.
Sure.
But yeah, the particular satisfactions that I get relate to the particular topics that I tackle, the reasons why I tackle them, the
Mm,
kind of ways I go about tackling them, and the kind of results that they can have, more widely with interlocutors and
mm,
readers,
mhm.
whatever.
Yeah.
And one of the frustrations is when I see people arguing about all kinds of stuff where I think, oh, they're reinventing the wheel. If only they'd read something I wrote where I dealt with these concepts.
Yep, yep. Final question. What would you give as a piece of advice to someone like me who wants to enter the discipline professionally?
Oh, probably the wrong person to ask that. Uh, Look, if you want to do well in the profession, I think the thing to do is get a placement in a really top quality program,
Mm,
with top quality people around you, and to learn from them, to soak up everything you can from them, to take their advice, see how they go about it. That's probably what you should do. But it's not something that I've really done. I mean, I did my PhD at Monash, which is a good program. Some great people there, but but I have not had the kind of life, the kind of career where I can say I know what you have to do to be a professional, academic philosopher and be highly successful within the discipline. I'm not the right person for that. I think the advice I've just given is correct, but it's advice
Sure,
you'd get from almost anybody.
sure. Well, to close, please, if you could tell people where they can learn more about your work and specifically your new book, The Tyranny of Opinion.
Okay. Uh, well, I do have a Twitter feed. You can just look for my name there, Russell Blackford, and you'll find me. I have a website. Again, if you just search
Hmm.
uh, my name, you'll find my own website. You'll also find my website, University of Newcastle, which has a little bit less information, though. The other website, my private website, is much messier.
Mm.
So maybe have a look at both of those. And those will list my books. If you go to Amazon and search on my name, and you find my Amazon author site, it sets out all of the books that I have published, and I have a little screen about myself which tells you about them. So yes, I'm online. I'm on Amazon author site. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook if you want to track me down there. I have a site at the University of Newcastle. I have a personal website. You can find all of that online.
Great.
And as for the latest book, well, it's available in all the obvious ways on Amazon and through all good bookshops, which will probably order it in if they don't actually have it in stock. It's published by Bloomsbury, by the academic arm of Bloomsbury, but Bloomsbury's quite a big publisher. They published, most famously, they published J.K. Rowling. Uh, that's where probably they get a large proportion of their money that
Yeah.
comes in. Not from me, but it's published by a quite sizable publisher. It has a certain amount of muscle, and you can track it down on
Yeah.
Amazon or even on Bloomsbury's own site.
Yeah, excellent. Well, Russell, you've been very generous with your time, and I've really, really enjoyed talking with you. Thank you so much for doing this.
Pleasure to talk to you too. That was great.
Take care.
Well, thank you too. Bye bye.
Bye. Well, I hope that you found that as valuable as I did. Like I said at the introduction, I really got a lot out of speaking to Russell. He was very generous with his time and with his insight. And if you want to check out any of Russell's work, I will leave links to all of his affiliated websites and information in the description below. And if you want to support this show and what I'm doing, you can go to patreon.com/Jordan Myers. You can find that link in the description below as well. And if you want to support me in non-monetary ways, you can also do that by sharing this show on Twitter or social media. You can rate it on Apple Podcasts. You can like this video or subscribe via YouTube or RSS feed. You can discuss my episode today or any other episode on your own show. And you can connect me with guests or recommend topics to cover. And you can get in contact with me at platoscavepodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter at Jordan_C_Myers. And all of this, of course, is in the description below. So thank you for watching, and as always, keep struggling to escape the cave. Plato's Cave is produced by Muckraker Media. You can find out more at muckrakermedia.org.